What's up, everyone? Welcome back to TFC On The Road. They say a club changes when it finds a star. Football usually tells a quieter story. Clubs change when a star fits the structure. When a striker does not simply finish moves, but reorganizes the entire pitch around his presence. That is why Josh Sargent's arrival at Toronto FC matters.
Cookie's taken the ball, plays it across, and it's gone in from Josh Sargent! Did it cross the line? It did! Josh Sargent has his first Premier League goal!
Not because one transfer can erase years of drift, but because this is the first signing of the rebuild that looks designed to connect every line of the team. A forward in his prime, a designated player bought for function, not spectacle. A number 9 shaped by Germany, refined in England, and now dropped into a Toronto side still trying to decide whether it is a possession team, a transition team, or something in between. The real question is not whether Sargent can score. The real question is what happens to Toronto's spacing, pressing, tempo, and identity once he becomes the reference point. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Early Signs. Before Toronto could understand what Josh Sargent might become in MLS, it first had to confront what it had been missing. The club's 2025 season was not defined by a lack of effort. It was defined by a lack of certainty in the final third. Toronto finished outside the playoff places again, and the attack often felt like an unfinished sentence. Possession could be circulated into wide areas. Midfielders could arrive between the lines, but the last action was rarely stable. There was no forward who could consistently pin center-backs, stretch the depth of the field, and still link the move when the first pass into him was difficult. That context matters because Sargent's profile was shaped by solving exactly those kinds of problems. At Werder Bremen, he entered senior football as a gifted runner, sharp over short distances and eager to attack channels. In a struggling side, he learned the harsher parts of center-forward play, receiving with contact on his back, defending from the front, and surviving long stretches with little service. At Norwich City, the role became more complete. The raw running remained, but the game slowed in useful ways. He began to recognize when to drift wide to create a passing lane, when to stay central and occupy both center-backs, and when to drop just enough to connect the next phase without emptying the box. The famous scorpion kick goal against Watford is often treated like a novelty, a clip built for highlight reels. In truth, it revealed something more technical. The finish came from speed of adjustment. Sargent did not wait for the perfect body shape. He interpreted the angle, improvised in traffic, and finished while moving away from the traditional mechanics of a striker's shot. That is not random flair, that is spatial intelligence. By the time Toronto moved for him, the statistical record at Norwich told part of the story. Goals, assists, volume, durability. But the more important signs were structural. He had become a forward who could score in the box, chase transitions into open grass, and survive the physical rhythm of the championship. For a club like Toronto, rebuilding from the spine outward, those are not decorative qualities. They are the first signs of a striker who can alter the geometry of the team around him. Chapter 2. Tactical Foundation. Robin Fraser did not inherit a blank canvas. He inherited a club with memories of one identity and the daily habits of another. Toronto still carried the emotional residue of the expensive, star-led experiment that never became a functioning collective. The rebuild, therefore, had to be more disciplined than dramatic. It had to replace reputation with role definition. That is why the sequence of signings matters. Djordje Mihailovic arrived as the creative hinge, a designated player chosen for chance creation rather than celebrity. Walker Zimmerman was added to harden the center of the defense. Matthias Pereira brought an attack-minded profile at left back. Daniel Saloy offered direct running and final third timing from wide areas. Even the right of first refusal deal with St. Louis to clear the path for Sargent showed the same logic. Toronto were not chasing noise. They were clearing logistical obstacles to secure a reference point. Fraser's coaching history also fits the idea. His best teams have usually valued spacing before style. They defend with structure, compress central zones, and ask attacking players to interpret moments without disconnecting the rest of the team. In Cincinnati early in 2026, Toronto used a back three with Richie Laryea and Raheem Edwards as wingbacks. Against Columbus, the shape looked closer to a back four with Sargent leading the line. That flexibility is important because it reveals what Fraser is really searching for. Not a fixed diagram, but a stable set of relationships. Sargent becomes vital inside that search because he gives the coach a common tactical language across different shapes. In a 3-4-2-1, he can occupy the center backs alone and create room underneath for Mihailovic or Saloy. In a 4-2-3-1, he can remain the lone striker while the wide players attack the half spaces around him. In a front two, he can drift toward the channel and leave central lanes for a partner. Toronto's rebuild was never just about adding talent. It was about choosing a center of gravity. Every team needs one area of the pitch that organizes the rest. For some sides, that is the holding midfielder. For others, it is the attacking playmaker. Toronto had already invested in the number 10 zone through Mihailovic. Sargent is the move that completes the triangle. He gives Fraser a striker who can turn creative service into territorial advantage, and territorial advantage into repeatable attacking structure. Chapter 3. How the system works. To understand what Sargent changes, it helps to picture Toronto's attack as a chain of distances. The center backs start the move. The midfield must receive under pressure. The playmaker finds the pocket. The striker decides whether the move stays alive or dies. In recent Toronto sides, the final link often broke. The striker line did not consistently secure the first forward pass, and so the team had to restart moves from wider or deeper positions. Sargent addresses that in 3 phases. First, the receiving phase. When Toronto build through Alonso Coelho, Jonathan Osorio, or Jose Cifuentes, Sargent can stand on the shoulder of the deepest defender and threaten the run behind. That simple threat moves the back line a step deeper. One step is enough. It enlarges the pocket for Mihailovic. It gives Saloy a lane to attack diagonally. It also gives fullbacks a cleaner crossing picture, because the defensive line cannot step up as aggressively if Sargent is already asking the question behind them. Second, the connection phase. Fraser described Sargent as a forward who can do everything: play with his back to goal, run in behind, finish crosses, and create his own shot. That versatility matters because Toronto do not always progress attacks the same way. Sometimes the ball will arrive into feet. Sometimes it will be clipped into the channel. Sometimes it will be driven wide and cut back. A limited striker forces the rest of the team to serve him in only one language. Sargent speaks several. Third, the defensive phase. Toronto's press becomes far more coherent when the striker can lead it with intelligence instead of just energy. Sargent does not need to win every ball. He needs to shape the first pass. If he closes the near center back at the right angle, the opponent is pushed toward the touchline. Once the ball travels there, Toronto's second wave can trap. Laurier can jump. Osorio can squeeze. The near center back can step. Pressing is controlled chaos, but only when the first runner knows how to bend the field. That is why this signing is bigger than finishing. Goals are the obvious product, but system value lies in the actions just before them. A striker who stretches depth, secures direct balls, presses with timing, and keeps center backs occupied gives the entire attack cleaner spacing. In football terms, he turns the number 9 position from an endpoint into a mechanism. Chapter 4. The Turning Point. Every rebuild has a moment when intention becomes visible. For Toronto, that moment arrived on February 27, 2026. The club announced that Josh Sargent had been signed as a designated player through the 2030-31 season. On the surface, it looked like a standard transfer announcement. In reality, it was a declaration of method. Toronto were not borrowing a fading name. They were committing one of their most valuable roster mechanisms to a 26-year-old striker entering his prime years. The details sharpen the point. Toronto not only reached a transfer agreement with Norwich City, but also had to acquire Sargent's right of first refusal. Lewis City, SC for Guaranteed General Allocation Money and Additional Conditional GAM. In MLS terms, that is administrative chess. The league's roster architecture can distort the transfer market, especially when returning American internationals are involved. Toronto navigated that complexity because the club believed the player justified the effort. That decision marks a turning point because it changes the hierarchy of risk. The earlier Toronto era often felt built on image first and fit second. Sargent reverses the order. His resume is strong, but the real attraction is his relevance. He arrives after 5 seasons at Norwich with 56 goals and 15 assists in 157 appearances, having also developed through the Bundesliga with Werder Bremen. More importantly, he arrives with traits that translate between leagues: movement before contact, repeated off-ball running, defensive work, and finishing variety. So symbolism in the timing. Toronto entered its 20th season while BMO Field moved through upgrades ahead of the 2026 World Cup. The city was preparing to host the sport on a global scale. The club, however, could not live on civic importance alone. It needed a footballing center. Sargent's signing gave the rebuild a visible spine, Mihailovic as creator, Zimmerman as organizer, Sargent as reference point. Turning points in football are rarely one match or one quote. They are moments when recruitment, coaching, and club identity finally start pulling in the same direction. That is what this move represents. Not certainty, not instant transformation, but alignment. And for a club that has spent several seasons looking fragmented, alignment may be the most important signing of all. Chapter 5. Myth versus reality. The public story around this transfer is simple. Toronto lacked goals. Toronto bought a striker. Problem solved. Football does not usually work that neatly. A number 9 can sharpen a blunt team, but he cannot repair every structural flaw by himself. That is the myth. The reality is more demanding and more interesting. First, Sargent is not arriving to be a one-man attack. He is arriving to make other actions more efficient. If the midfield cannot progress the ball, he will spend too much time wrestling for low-value touches. If the wide players fail to arrive inside the box, opponents can crowd him with 2 central defenders and a screening midfielder. If Toronto's rest defense is weak, the team will hesitate to commit numbers around him, and the attack will lose weight. A striker can organize the final third, but he still depends on the platform behind him. Second, the best parts of Sargent's profile may not be the headline number. Toronto scored only 37 league goals in 2025, and no striker produced more than 4. Naturally, the eye goes straight to finishing, but Robin Fraser and Jonathan Osorio both emphasized something broader: work rate, balance, and the unselfish labor that makes collective football function. That is the tactical truth. Sargent matters because he reduces the amount of special pleading a move requires. He can attack the near post on one sequence, drop into a layoff on the next, and then lead the press after possession is lost. Third, there is a false debate between individual brilliance and system football. In reality, good teams need both. Sargent's scorpion kick goal remains memorable because it was unusual, but unusual finishing only has value when it sits inside repeatable attacking habits. Toronto are not paying for a viral moment. They are paying for repeatability. For the kind of striker who turns wide service into credible threat every week, not only on highlight nights. So the reality is not that Sargent will save Toronto. It is that he may finally give Toronto a reason to stop improvising around the center-forward position. He narrows the list of excuses. He raises the tactical floor. And if the supporting cast around him becomes coherent, then the goal totals can follow as a consequence rather than a miracle. Chapter 6. Silent Evolution. The most important sentence in Toronto's announcement may have been the simplest one. Josh Sargent is just beginning to enter the prime of his career. In football, prime years are often discussed as if they are purely physical. For center forwards, they are usually cognitive as well. The body still has speed, but the game now arrives with less surprise. The striker sees the pattern half a second earlier. That is the silent evolution in Sargent's career. In his early professional years, the emphasis was on potential. His acceleration, his youth national team pedigree, his willingness to chase difficult runs. Over time, the job description widened. In Bremen, adversity taught him how to play without comfort. In Norwich, repetition taught him the economy of movement. Not every action needs to be explosive. Sometimes the smartest striker move is to stay still for one extra beat, to pin the defender in place so the runner beyond can appear. This is where his move to Toronto becomes especially interesting. MLS defending can be physically intense but structurally uneven. Distances between lines are not always compact, and transition moments can become chaotic very quickly. A striker who only lives on instinct may score, but he may also disappear in the wrong game states. A striker with layered experience across Germany and England can manipulate those moments better. He understands when to make the first run, when to delay for the second wave, and when to use contact rather than pace. There is also the psychological evolution. Sargent arrives not as a prospect asking for patience, but as a senior attacker expected to define standards. Toronto's leadership spoke openly about culture when announcing him. That should not be dismissed as front office wallpaper. The best center forwards shape culture because they live at the front edge of every phase. They trigger the press, absorb frustration when service is poor, and keep making runs when the previous four did not end in a shot. A silent evolution is rarely glamorous. It is built in details. Body orientation, pressing angles, the timing of a near-post dart, the decision to lay off instead of forcing a turn. But those details are exactly why Toronto targeted this version of Sargent. Not the prospect, not the highlight, the completed mechanism that those earlier stages were pointing toward. Chapter 7. Long-term impact. Transfers are often judged too early. A striker scores twice in his first month and the move is called a success. He starts slowly and the doubt begins. The more important impact is usually slower. What habits become possible because he is there? What recruiting decisions now make more sense? What style can finally be trained every week without contradiction? Sargent's arrival could have that kind of long-term effect on Toronto. With Mihailovic underneath and a credible number 9 ahead of him, the club can now recruit complementary wide players instead of emergency creators. Fullbacks can be selected for timing and delivery because there is a true target in the box. Midfielders can be judged on progression and balance rather than on whether they can also solve the final pass every third possession. Even academy forwards will develop against a clearer reference model. There is also an identity question. Toronto once had a clear football image under Greg Vanney. Positional control, wing-back width, a midfield engine room, and a striker line that gave the team gravity. Since then, identities have blurred. Sargent does not restore that era, but he does offer a new anchor for the next one. A Fraser team with Zimmerman organizing the back line, Mihailovic shaping the creative center, and Sargent leading the front can begin to look like a side built with sequence in mind rather than reaction. The wider timing matters too. Toronto, the city, is about to host the world. Stadium upgrades are underway. The football conversation in Canada is shifting upward. For Toronto FC, this increases the cost of being vague. The club cannot merely participate in the atmosphere around the World Cup. It has to look like an institution moving with purpose inside that moment. Sargent helps because he is both symbolic and practical. An American international with European credibility, but also a striker whose game is rooted in hard tactical labor. Long-term impact in football is not always measured in trophies at first. Sometimes it is measured in coherence, in whether a club finally starts making decisions that point to the same picture. If Toronto's attack becomes more stable, if its pressing gains a front edge, if its recruitment now builds outward from a reliable spine, then Josh Sargent's arrival will mean more than goals. It will mean the rebuild found its center. Ending closure. Josh Sargent's arrival should not be understood as a miracle or even as a simple transfer win. It is better understood as a structural choice. Toronto FC have spent several seasons searching for an identity that could survive beyond slogans, beyond star names, beyond the next short-term fix. In Sargent, the club have chosen a striker whose value lies in how many parts of the game he can stabilize at once. The finishing matters. The pedigree matters. But the deeper significance is tactical. He gives the attack a focal point, the press a trigger, the rebuild a spine, and the project a clearer shape. Football is rarely about noise. It is about structure. Legacies are built in details, not headlines. This channel explores the tactical stories behind the modern game. Thanks for following along with TFC On The Road. If you enjoyed this update and want more Toronto FC content, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. We'll be back soon with another edition covering the latest news, matches, and behind-the-scenes stories. Until then, stay safe and keep cheering on the Reds.